Before you judge what you're about to hear, remember this. Every empire is born from pain. Nuestra Familia wasn't created in a boardroom. It was forged in blood, behind concrete walls, by men the system tried to erase. Today, we uncover the truth they never wanted you to know. Subscribe, stay until the end, and discover how a promise of brotherhood became one of America's most feared criminal empires. In the early 1960s, the California prison system was a boiling cauldron of rage, inequality, and racial tension. Behind those iron bars, survival was a language spoken through violence. Inmates didn't need words, only glances, alliances, and scars. The prisons were divided along invisible lines that ran deeper than any wall, lines of race, geography, and identity. Whites, blacks, and Latinos lived in perpetual conflict, each group carving out territories in the yard like miniature nations. But among the Latinos, there was an even deeper fracture, a war brewing between men who shared the same blood but different roots. The norteños, from the agricultural valleys of Northern California, and the sureños, from the barrios of the South. For years, Southern Mexican-American inmates dominated through fear. They called themselves La M, short for La Mafia Mexicana, the Mexican Mafia. They saw themselves as the aristocracy of the prisons, demanding tribute, respect, and control over anyone who crossed their path. To them, the northern Mexicans, often farm workers' sons who spoke English with an accent or mixed slang, were inferior, unrefined, and expendable. That arrogance translated into bloodshed. Northern inmates were beaten, robbed, and humiliated. Some were forced to fight each other for the entertainment of La M's soldiers. Others were killed simply for refusing to kneel. Inside Soledad Prison, officially the correctional training facility, the air was heavy with the stench of sweat, fear, and resentment. The guards turned a blind eye to most of it. They saw the violence as a way to maintain control. If the inmates were too busy fighting each other, they wouldn't rise against the system. But beneath that surface chaos, something was beginning to take form. An idea whispered in the dark, passed between bruised lips and clenched fists. A few northern inmates began to question how long they could endure the humiliation. "We are not their slaves," one of them reportedly said. "We are our own men. We are our own family." That word, family, became the seed of something dangerous. It started with protection. They formed small groups for survival, defending each other in the yard, sharing food and watching each other's backs. They began to recognize each other, not by race, but by origin. The towns and fields of Northern California, where they had grown up poor but proud. Their loyalty was not born of greed, but of necessity. In the brutal world of prison politics, unity was the only weapon the weak could wield. Slowly, quietly, they organized. La M noticed, and they didn't like it. Rumors spread through the prison. A northern resistance was forming, a group of men unwilling to submit. One day in 1965, a confrontation exploded in the yard, a stabbing that would later be remembered as the moment the North stood up to the South. Blood spilled on the concrete, and the balance of power shifted forever. Those who survived the clash were thrown into isolation. But what the system failed to understand was that isolation only forged their resolve. Behind bars within bars, the men who would later become the founders of Nuestra Familia began to write their own laws. They spoke of brotherhood, discipline, and retaliation. If the Southern Mafia could form an organization, so could they. But theirs would be something different, something built not on dominance, but on unity and vengeance. Their language began to evolve. They called each other carnal, brother. They developed codes, ranks, and oaths whispered through the bars. They drew inspiration from military order, creating structure amid chaos. Soon, the word family took on a sacred meaning. It wasn't just about blood anymore. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond forged through pain. Every man who joined did so knowing that betrayal meant death, but in a world where life already meant suffering, death was a price many were willing to pay. Outside the prison, in the farmlands of Northern California, the Chicano civil rights movement was rising. Latinos were beginning to find their voice, demanding equality and recognition. Inside the prisons, Nuestra Familia became their reflection, twisted by violence but born from the same yearning for dignity. In a sense, they were a distorted mirror of the social revolution outside, where activists raised fists in protest, the inmates raised knives in defiance. Both wanted respect. One chose words, the other blood. As the group grew, the prison authorities noticed the shift. Fights became more organized, contraband began to move in strategic patterns, and communication between northern inmates across multiple facilities became alarmingly efficient. What had started as self-defense was evolving into an underground movement. And while guards dismissed it as just another gang rivalry, the foundations of an empire were being laid brick by brick, or more accurately, cell by cell. By the late 1960s, the name Nuestra Familia, our family, began to circulate in whispers among the inmates. Some said it was coined in the segregation units of Soledad. Others claim it was born in Folsom Prison, where the first written codes were drafted. Regardless of where it began, its meaning was clear. It was not a name chosen by chance. It was a declaration. We are not yours. We belong to ourselves. That idea, dangerous, defiant, and deeply human, was what made Nuestra Familia different from other prison gangs. It was more than a criminal enterprise. It was an identity. For men stripped of their names, their freedom, and their dignity, La Familia gave them purpose. In that twisted world of steel and concrete, they had found belonging. But every flame that burns for freedom also casts a shadow. The unity that once protected them would soon turn into the hunger for power. The men who wanted justice would become the very thing they once despised. Yet in 1965, they couldn't see that far. All they knew was that they were no longer alone, and that the fire they had ignited in those cells would soon consume the entire state of California. The moment the first drop of blood hit the concrete in Soledad Prison, a new kind of power was born. Not of law or justice, but of loyalty. Out of the chaos of prison riots and racial divisions, the men from the north began to shape something that would outlive them all. They didn't yet call it Nuestra Familia, but the essence was already there. An unspoken bond forged through fear, humiliation, and survival. Inside those walls, words carried weight, but silence carried more. Every stare, every nod in the yard was a secret conversation, an affirmation that they were part of something bigger than themselves. By 1966, those whispers had become organized. The leaders of this northern resistance, men hardened by isolation and time, began to write their own rules. They called it La Constitución de Nuestra Familia. It wasn't a formal document at first, just handwritten notes, smuggled letters, and coded words passed from cell to cell. But it carried the force of sacred scripture. Its message was clear. The family was everything. Loyalty was life. Betrayal was death. There was no middle ground. Each member swore an oath, not to a god, not to a flag, but to La Familia. The ceremony was simple but terrifying in its intensity. A man would slice his finger with a razor, letting a drop of blood fall onto a piece of cloth or paper while reciting the words, Mi vida por la familia, my life for the family. From that moment on, he was bound by an invisible chain that no prison gate could break. The family became both mother and executioner, a source of belonging, but also of absolute control. The founders, often referred to as generales or generals, envisioned more than just a gang. They wanted an organization, disciplined, structured, and intelligent. Many of them had military experience or had observed how the system itself maintained order through hierarchy, so they mirrored it. Nuestra Familia adopted a command chain, from the highest generals down to soldiers known as soldados. Orders flowed from the top, and obedience was non-negotiable. Those who disobeyed didn't get warnings. They got buried. Inside Soledad, Folsom, and San Quentin, the Familia began to recruit with precision. They looked for men with backbone, prisoners who had endured beatings, who had scars to show but refused to bow. They didn't just want killers, they wanted believers. Discipline was paramount. Members were forbidden to use drugs excessively, to steal from other norteños, or to disrespect their brothers. Ironically, what began as a violent uprising against oppression slowly developed its own moral code. Brutal but consistent. And the code worked. Word of the family spread like fire through the California Department of Corrections. Northern inmates, long outnumbered and brutalized, now had a banner to unite under. The Familia gave them power, identity, and purpose. It gave them a cause worth dying for. With that came organization, and with organization came control. The Mexican mafia, once untouchable, began to face resistance. The Northerners no longer knelt. They fought back, coordinated, strategic, and unyielding. The prison guards, meanwhile, were oblivious to the scale of what was forming. To them, it was just another group of inmates aligning by geography, a nuisance among many. They didn't see the structure, the discipline, the ambition. They didn't see the meetings that took place through coded letters known as kites, or the way orders were smuggled out of isolation units using tiny pieces of paper hidden in legal mail. Every member knew his role. Every move had purpose. Nuestra Familia was no longer a rumor. It was an institution. In 1967, the first written version of the Constitution was finalized. It outlined not just rules, but ideology. It spoke of unity among northern Chicanos, of defending their people from southern tyranny. It was half political, half spiritual, a call for revolution inside prison walls. But with ideology came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came the corruption of power. The generals, locked away in solitary cells, began to control entire blocks of inmates as if commanding troops from a battlefield. They decided who lived and who died. They orchestrated attacks with surgical precision, often carried out in silence. A quick blade in the shower, a razor taped to a toothbrush, a whisper before the strike. For the family. Over time, the oath that once symbolized protection turned into a weapon of fear. No one could leave the family. Once blood was shed for it, your life no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the cause. And yet, for many men inside those walls, it was the first time they had ever felt part of something meaningful. Growing up poor, fatherless, and invisible to society, the family filled a void the world never cared to notice. It gave them identity in a place that stripped men of their names. But identity came at a price. As Nuestra Familia expanded its reach, internal power struggles began to surface. Ambitious soldiers sought control. Informants infiltrated their ranks. The FBI began to take notice. The gang's operations spilled beyond the prison walls into the streets of Northern California, where local street gangs like the Norteños began to operate under their guidance. The oath had evolved from a prison ritual into a transgenerational code of conduct, a culture of loyalty and retribution that would stretch from cell blocks to neighborhoods, from the 1960s to the modern day. Still, in those early years, the founders believed they were building something righteous, a brotherhood that stood for respect and unity. They didn't yet see the monster that was forming behind their ideals. Each man who took the blood oath thought he was reclaiming his dignity. None of them imagined they were creating a machine that would outlive them, that would demand endless sacrifice. In the dim light of Soledad's isolation cells, one of the founders reportedly said to a new recruit, "The family will protect you. But remember, once you join, you are born again, and in this life, the only way out is death." The recruit nodded, slicing his finger without hesitation. The drop of blood fell, sealing his fate. Nuestra Familia was no longer an idea. It was alive, breathing, growing, and hungering. And soon, it would wage war on the very system that had created it. By the dawn of the 1970s, California had become a battlefield, divided not by geography, but by blood. Inside the state's prison system, a Cold War had turned hot. A war fought in silence, with shanks carved from metal scraps, with coded letters, and with bodies found bleeding in the shower before dawn. On one side stood Nuestra Familia, the voice and vengeance of Northern California's Chicano inmates. On the other, La M, the Mexican mafia, ruthless, powerful, and already entrenched deep within the system. Their feud would spill beyond the prison walls and consume entire generations of young men who had never even seen the inside of a cell. It began quietly, a whispered insult in the yard, a look that lasted too long, a rumor about a stolen commissary shipment. In prison, the smallest spark ignited infernos. Nuestra Familia had declared itself a force, not just for survival, but for dominance. Their founders had written a code, an ideology, and a structure. They saw themselves as warriors, protectors of the norteños, northern Mexicans, farm workers, and small-town Chicanos who had grown up picking fruit under the California sun. To them, the South represented oppression, the slick, city-born gangsters of La M who looked down on the North as lesser. The divide grew deeper when the prison authorities, either ignorant or manipulative, began to separate inmates by region, northern and southern. Instead of reducing tension, this segregation drew the battle lines more clearly. Each side built its own identity. The southern inmates began marking themselves with the number 13, for the 13th letter of the alphabet, M, representing La M. The northern inmates, following Nuestra Familia, adopted 14 for N, their symbol of defiance. The numbers became flags in an invisible war. Soon, these identities escaped the prison gates. Young Latinos in the streets of San Jose, Stockton, and Modesto began to call themselves norteños, wearing red bandanas, tattooing the number 14, and adopting the cause of the family. Meanwhile, the streets of Los Angeles, San Diego, and other southern cities became strongholds for the Sureños, who pledged allegiance to La M. The war that had started behind steel doors was now being fought on asphalt. At first, neither group understood how deeply this division would cut into their culture. What had once been a conflict between imprisoned men became a generational identity. The prisons trained the soldiers, but the streets raised the armies, and every neighborhood, every block, became a battlefield. Inside the walls, the conflict took on ritualistic form. Kill orders were sent through kites, tiny folded letters smuggled in food trays, shoes, or body cavities. The messages were brief and coded, but their meaning was clear. Eliminate the target. A single word could mean death. Green light, they called it, a signal that someone had been marked for execution. Inmates learned to sleep with one eye open, to never turn their back in the yard. Every handshake could hide a blade. In 1971, the bloodshed reached a new height. Nuestra Familia's influence had spread to nearly every major correctional facility in California. Its members executed coordinated attacks on rival Sureños across multiple prisons on the same day, a demonstration of discipline and reach that shocked the authorities. The California Department of Corrections began to recognize that they were not dealing with just gangs, but militarized organizations capable of strategic warfare. Meanwhile, outside the prisons, the war took a more chaotic form. Young norteños, inspired by the prison legends, began waging street battles against Sureño sets. Drive-by shootings, stabbings, and ambushes became routine. Innocents were often caught in the crossfire, but to the young men drawn into the war, it didn't matter. They weren't just fighting for money or drugs, they were fighting for identity, for the idea that they belonged to something larger, something eternal. Every symbol became a declaration. red for the norteños, blue for the sureños. Por versus trin. Even the Spanish language itself became a weapon. Norteños used words like cohete for gun, while sureños used fierro. Their dialects split, their music changed, their culture fractured. The line that once ran through prison walls now ran through California's soul. Nuestra Familia capitalized on that division. The gang's leaders, still imprisoned, realized that control of the streets meant control of the money. Through intermediaries, they began taxing norteño gangs, demanding a share of drug profits, robberies, and other criminal enterprises in exchange for protection and recognition. Anyone who refused was labeled a traitor. Many were murdered. It was the evolution of the family into an empire, a criminal network with its headquarters inside the state's most secure prisons. But power has a cost. As the norteños grew more organized, La M retaliated with brutal precision. They used hitmen from allied gangs, corrupted guards, and sometimes even manipulated transfers to ensure their enemies were placed within reach. The violence became so severe that prison officials were forced to permanently segregate norteños and sureños in different facilities. Yet even that couldn't stop the blood from flowing. Letters and orders continued to pass through hidden channels, a constant pulse of war that never stopped beating. By the mid-1980s, California's prison system was effectively split into two kingdoms, the North and the South. Both ruled through fear and code, both convinced of their righteousness. Nuestra Familia justified its violence as protection, while La M framed theirs as retribution. Neither saw the irony that they had become reflections of each other, mirror images locked in an endless cycle of vengeance. The war gave birth to legends. Tales of loyalty, betrayal, and impossible survival spread across prison yards and barrios alike. Young recruits whispered the names of fallen soldiers as if they were saints. Songs were written, murals painted, and stories passed down, not as warnings, but as inspiration. The war had become a culture, a religion of violence. And yet, beneath the blood and mythology, the truth remained. Both sides were prisoners of the same system that had created them. Men who had been born into poverty, shaped by discrimination, and left behind by society, were now dying for flags painted in red and blue. Their war wasn't just against each other. It was against a world that had given them nothing but cages. The silent war that split California was never about victory. It was about identity. A desperate cry for belonging that echoed through prison corridors and city streets alike. And as the decades passed, it became clear that Nuestra Familia and La M were no longer just gangs fighting for control. They were two halves of the same tragedy, a brotherhood torn apart, locked in a dance of death that neither could escape. By the early 1980s, the name Nuestra Familia had evolved from a whispered oath into a symbol of authority that reached far beyond the prison walls. What began as a desperate alliance of northern inmates now commanded an army that stretched across cities, counties, and entire regions of California. From the narrow corridors of Folsom Prison to the back alleys of San Jose, the family's influence was everywhere, silent, invisible yet absolute. Inside the prisons, the organization had refined itself into a military hierarchy. Orders no longer traveled by rumor, but through coded messages known as huelgas, strikes. High-ranking generals, locked in isolation cells for years, directed entire networks of soldiers they would never meet in person. The system was terrifying in its precision. Generals gave commands to captains, captains to lieutenants, lieutenants to soldiers. Each member knew his rank, his duty, and his penalty for failure. Nuestra Familia was not chaos. It was discipline. It was structure masquerading as rebellion. But what truly gave them power was their reach beyond the fences. On the outside, norteño gangs, neighborhood crews from cities like Stockton, Salinas, and Fresno, began to align under the family's banner. At first, these street groups were independent, surviving through small-scale crime, drug sales, robberies, petty violence. But as the family's leaders realized the potential of these young foot soldiers, they turned them into extensions of their empire. From their prison cells, the generals began to issue directivas, written in intricate codes, often smuggled out through lawyers, corrupt guards, or even religious visitors. These orders dictated everything: which territories to control, how much tax each street gang owed, and who to eliminate if they disobeyed. The message was clear: the streets belonged to the family. Within a few short years, Nuestra Familia had transformed the entire Northern California underworld into a single chain of command. Every norteño gang, no matter how small, paid la renta, the tax, to the family. Those who refused were marked with a green light, meaning open season. No excuses, no warnings. The family didn't need to send armies. It only needed a word. Fear did the rest. And so, from the shadows of concrete walls, Nuestra Familia began to control the flow of drugs, money, and murder across the state. Cocaine and methamphetamine were the new currencies of loyalty. They flooded the barrios like poison, each transaction feeding back into the prison economy. For every dollar earned on the street, a percentage found its way into the hands of men serving life sentences, proof that the family was eternal even if its members weren't. By the late 1980s, federal and state authorities began to notice something strange. Crimes committed miles apart, in cities that had no direct connection, bore the same signature, the same methods, the same coded notes, the same victims. It didn't make sense until investigators realized the truth. All these crimes were being orchestrated from inside prison walls. Nuestra Familia had built a criminal infrastructure more sophisticated than many legitimate businesses. Every smuggled letter, every phone call, every coded prayer carried instructions. Even behind bars, they were untouchable. The family's internal structure continued to evolve. Its leadership council, known as La Mesa, the table, acted as a governing body that approved executions, managed drug routes, and resolved disputes between factions. Beneath them, regional commanders, called carnales, handled the day-to-day operations across counties and cities. Their control extended into every aspect of norteño life, from how gang members dressed to the music they listened to which tattoos they were allowed to wear. Red bandanas and the number 14 became more than symbols. They were declarations of allegiance. Yet beneath this order, cracks began to appear. Power, as always, breeds betrayal. Some street leaders resented the taxes they were forced to pay. Others began to question why they should die for men who would never see the sun again. Tension grew between the older generation, the imprisoned generals, and the younger soldiers who now ruled the streets. The family was expanding faster than it could control, and ambition was becoming a more dangerous weapon than any blade. Meanwhile, the authorities escalated their response. Task forces were formed, informants planted, and surveillance tightened. But even the FBI underestimated the family's resilience. Every time they cut off one head, another rose. The structure was too decentralized, too ingrained in the culture of the norteños. Killing a leader didn't destroy the ideology, it only immortalized it. For the new recruits, prison wasn't a punishment, it was initiation. Behind bars, they would finally meet the legends they had heard of, men whose names were spoken like saints and whose orders were treated like gospel. On the streets, however, the human cost was devastating. Northern California's small towns became war zones. Teenagers barely out of school carried guns and memorized codes of conduct older than their fathers. Families buried their sons before they turned 20. The dream of unity that had given birth to Nuestra Familia decades earlier had turned into an empire of blood. By the 1990s, the family had become so powerful that it could conduct simultaneous hits across multiple prisons and cities, all coordinated through handwritten notes and encrypted phrases. The table has spoken, one message would say, and somewhere, miles away, a man would die before the ink dried. That level of control fascinated law enforcement and terrified communities. Nuestra Familia was no longer just a gang. It was a shadow government with its own economy, army, and laws. Still, for all its power, the family couldn't escape the cycle it had created. The more it expanded, the more it depended on violence to survive. Loyalty had to be enforced through fear, and that fear demanded constant blood. The organization that once promised protection for the northern Chicanos had become their greatest predator. Inside the walls, the original generals watched as their creation transformed into something monstrous. Some still believed in the old ideals: unity, respect, identity. But others saw only greed and betrayal. The war with La M had spread so far that even the purpose was forgotten. It wasn't about North versus South anymore. It was about power, pure and corrupting. And so, as California's prisons filled to capacity and the streets burned with red and blue, Nuestra Familia entered a new era, one defined not by survival but by control. They had achieved the impossible, an empire without freedom, ruled from within cages. But the larger the empire grew, the harder it became to contain, and soon the same walls that once protected them would begin to close in. By the 1990s, Nuestra Familia had reached the peak of its power. Its influence flowed like blood through every vein of Northern California's underworld. From the smallest street corner in Salinas to the darkest isolation cell in Pelican Bay, every order, every act of violence, and every dollar earned was a testament to the family's control. It was no longer just a prison gang. It had evolved into a shadow empire, a government of fear built by men in cages. But empires, no matter how powerful, rot from the inside long before they crumble from the outside. Inside the high-security units of Pelican Bay State Prison, the organization's top generals operated with almost religious devotion. Locked away 23 hours a day, they communicated through codes carved into soap bars, hidden messages inside legal mail, and whispers exchanged in the brief minutes of yard time. The guards believed they were isolated, but in truth, they commanded legions. Through layers of intermediaries, they managed the drug trade, extortion rackets, and contract killings both inside and outside the prison. Some called them the Council. Others simply La Mesa, the table. They were the invisible architects of the family's empire. Under their command, Nuestra Familia maintained an intricate web of control over the norteños. Street-level gangs spread across dozens of cities. Every gang, every neighborhood clique owed taxes to the family. Those who failed to pay faced swift retribution. The killings were methodical, almost bureaucratic. In one case, a man who skimmed $200 from a meth sale was stabbed 67 times in a garage in Modesto. In another, a letter intercepted by police described in cold detail how to make it quick and quiet for the family. These weren't random acts of violence anymore. They were executions ordered by men who hadn't touched freedom in decades. But with success came paranoia. The bigger the family grew, the harder it became to distinguish loyalty from ambition. Younger recruits wanted power, not ideology. They admired the old generals but also envied them. Some began to question the constant bloodshed. Others saw opportunity. If the leaders could give orders from prison, why couldn't they be replaced? Betrayal became a language as common as loyalty. The state and federal authorities saw their chance. The FBI and the California Department of Justice launched one of the most ambitious operations in the history of organized crime enforcement, Operation Black Widow. The name carried a fitting symbolism, a deadly spider unraveling its own web. Investigators infiltrated the organization from within, flipping mid-level members and embedding undercover agents. For years, they built a case, collecting wiretaps, letters, and testimonies that would expose the full structure of Nuestra Familia. The turning point came in the late 1990s, when a single letter intercepted from Pelican Bay changed everything. Written in coded Spanish, it detailed a hit order against a rival in San Jose. When investigators decrypted it, they realized they were looking at something unprecedented. A murder order signed by the top brass of the family, approved by a council of men serving life sentences. The revelation was explosive. It proved that the organization was not just active, but thriving, its command structure functioning seamlessly despite maximum security confinement. In 2001, after years of surveillance, wiretaps, and hundreds of arrests, Operation Black Widow struck. The FBI raided homes, prisons, and safe houses across California. Dozens of high-ranking members, including Nuestra Familia generals, were indicted under the Federal RICO Act, a law designed to dismantle criminal enterprises by targeting their leadership. The indictments painted a chilling picture: an organization that treated murder like administration, profit like religion, and fear like law. The trials that followed were unlike anything the courts had ever seen. Prosecutors presented letters written in invisible ink, phone recordings smuggled through third-party lines, and testimonies from former members who had lived to regret their oath. Many of those who testified did so behind black screens, their identities hidden. Even the government couldn't guarantee their safety. The jury listened as former generals described how orders were passed from prison to street, how a man's life could be decided with a single word, and how La Mesa had become both the heart and the disease of Nuestra Familia. When the verdicts came, they hit hard: life sentences, decades behind bars. The family's most feared generals, men whose names had once echoed in every northern barrio, were now sealed away, stripped of their power. Newspapers called it the death of Nuestra Familia. But inside, among those who knew the truth, there was only silence, because even in defeat, the family never really dies. Behind the bars of Pelican Bay, the surviving leaders watched the world change. Their empire had been dismantled, their soldiers scattered, but their ideology endured. Letters still moved through the prison system. Young recruits still swore oaths. On the streets, violence didn't stop. It adapted. A new generation of norteños rose, less disciplined, more chaotic, but loyal to the same blood-red banner. The FBI had decapitated the beast, but the body continued to crawl. Some of the old generals tried to reflect on what they had built. In interviews and court depositions, a few admitted what they once denied, that the family had lost its soul. What began as a defense against oppression had become an empire of death. The code of loyalty that once united them now chained them to their past. They had become prisoners not just of their crimes, but of their creation. In one of the final recorded statements from a Nuestra Familia leader before his sentencing, he said, "We thought we were building a home, but we built a graveyard instead." It was a rare moment of clarity, a confession that echoed through decades of violence. The family's rise had been born from injustice, but its fall came from within. The walls that once kept them safe became their tomb. And yet, even as their empire collapsed, the myth remained. Young men still whispered their names in the barrios, still tattooed NF on their skin, still believed in the legend of La Familia. Because in places where poverty, loneliness, and anger ruled, the idea of belonging, even to a monster, was stronger than the fear of death. The empire had fallen, but the ideology endured. And somewhere, deep within the echoing corridors of Pelican Bay, a message continued to circulate, quiet, dangerous, and eternal. The family never dies. The story of Nuestra Familia does not end with gunfire or prison walls. Its real ending, if one can call it that, lies in the silence that followed. After decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and control, what remained was not an empire, but a question. How could something born out of injustice transform into one of the most violent and feared criminal organizations in American history? The answer, buried beneath layers of loyalty and corruption, reveals a truth that is both tragic and deeply human. Behind the mythology, Nuestra Familia was never just a gang. It was a response, a distorted reflection of a broken system. In the beginning, those who formed it weren't monsters. They were men who had been stripped of dignity. Chicanos from the fields of Northern California, migrant sons of forgotten families, thrown into prisons where survival meant submission. They created the family because they needed to belong, to protect each other from abuse, to find order in a world designed to destroy them. The ideology of unity and resistance was their lifeline, but power, like rust, corrodes even the purest metal. Over time, the same structure that gave them strength turned into a cage of its own making. Inside that cage, loyalty became religion. The code, once meant to defend, became an instrument of fear. The blood oath that once symbolized brotherhood now demanded sacrifice. Men killed not for justice, but for hierarchy. Generals executed their own soldiers to preserve authority. Soldiers murdered friends to prove loyalty. The family's founding idea, dignity, was buried under the weight of its own violence. Yet within that paradox lies the hidden truth. Nuestra Familia was not only a story of crime, but a mirror held up to a society that had already failed its sons. In the barrios of Salinas, Watsonville, and Stockton, entire generations grew up under the shadow of the family. For them, the red flag of the Norteños wasn't just a symbol of gang life, it was a symbol of identity. It meant pride in being from the North, defiance in the face of marginalization, and loyalty to something that gave them a name when the world gave them nothing. Teachers, social workers, and even police officers in these communities came to understand that the family's power didn't just come from fear, it came from purpose. In the absence of opportunity, ideology filled the void. Inside prison, the same realization began to dawn on some of the old generals. Men who had once written death sentences now wrote letters to community activists, reflecting on the destruction they had caused. Some sought forgiveness, others education. One former member, who spent more than 30 years behind bars, described his transformation in an interview. "They told us we were soldiers. They told us we were protecting our people, but we were killing our own." His voice cracked when he said it. Not from weakness, but from recognition. For the first time, he understood that Nuestra Familia had become the very oppressor it was created to fight. The system, in many ways, had built the monster it was now trying to destroy. The overcrowded prisons, the racial divisions, the economic inequality, all of it had provided fertile ground for La Familia to grow. When the state separated Norteños and Sureños into different facilities to control violence, it didn't kill the war, it institutionalized it. The prisons became breeding grounds for ideology. Each new generation of inmates inherited the same narratives of loyalty, the same cycles of revenge. By trying to contain the family, the system ensured its survival. But among the ruins, there were sparks of change. Some former members began to turn their knowledge into resistance against the very culture they once built. They joined rehabilitation programs, mentoring youth to prevent them from following the same path. In cities like Watsonville and Salinas, community initiatives started by ex-gang members aimed to show teenagers that identity doesn't have to be bought with blood. They spoke openly about their past, their regrets, and their losses. Brothers, cousins, friends buried because of a code that never loved them back. Still, redemption is a fragile thing. For every man who finds peace, 100 others remain trapped in the cycle. Men who still carry the ideology of Nuestra Familia like a tattoo on the soul. They live between pride and shame, between the dream of belonging and the nightmare of control. And perhaps that is the ultimate tragedy. The family was never truly destroyed because it was never just an organization. It was an idea, and ideas, even corrupted ones, are hard to kill. The hidden truth of Nuestra Familia is not about guns or drugs or power. It's about human need, the need to be seen, the need to belong, the need to matter in a world that tells you you're nothing. The family offered that illusion, a place to belong, a name to carry. And even as its leaders rotted in cells and its empire turned to dust, that illusion still called to the lost and forgotten. Because in every prison, in every impoverished neighborhood, there will always be someone looking for family. In the final analysis, Nuestra Familia stands as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that when systems fail to provide justice, others will rise to imitate it, even in twisted forms. When respect is denied, violence becomes a language. And when dignity is taken, men will build their own kingdoms of control, no matter how doomed. One retired FBI agent who spent decades investigating the gang said it best: "We could arrest 1,000 of them, lock them all away, and the family would still exist, because you can't arrest the reason it was born." So, the legend endures. Not as glory, not as victory, but as a haunting reminder of what happens when pain is inherited and never healed. The family that began as a brotherhood became an empire of death, and in its ashes, a mirror reflecting both the violence of the oppressed and the indifference of the powerful. And somewhere in a cell, an old man with faded tattoos sits in silence, writing letters to no one. His hands tremble as he signs his name, not as a general, not as a soldier, but as a man finally free from the illusion. He folds the paper and whispers, almost to himself, "We were supposed to protect each other. But the family devoured us all."